At my son's incredibly lavish luxury wedding, my brand new daughter-in-law viciously slapped my wife across the face in front of 400 elite high society guests. She looked down at my beautiful wife's bleeding cheek and aggressively told her to get out, genuinely thinking we were just a couple of pathetic retirees crashing her special day. My son, the boy I had raised to be a king, just stood there and completely watched. He did not know that with one single phone call, I was about to completely wipe out his entire future, legally seize her family's massive ancestral estate, and turn their expensive dream wedding into an absolute federal crime scene. My name is Langston. I am 75 years old, and I am the quiet, unseen architect of one of the absolute largest private commercial real estate empires in the city of Atlanta. Before I tell you exactly how I meticulously dismantled their entitled lives, piece by piece in under 48 hours, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you strongly believe that profound disrespect should always be met with ruthless, calculating consequences. Now, let me take you back to the exact moment my family was completely destroyed and my empire officially went to war. The sharp, violent crack of skin against skin loudly echoed over the soft jazz playing in the grand ballroom. It was a sound so sudden and incredibly violent that it seemed to actively suck the oxygen right out of the massive room. The jazz band on the stage stopped abruptly. The saxophone player lowered his instrument in pure shock, while the upright bass player quickly slapped his hand over the thick strings to kill the heavy vibration. The sudden silence that followed was significantly heavier than a concrete vault. I was standing exactly 10 feet away, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider, when I saw my wife of 50 years, Josephine, stumble hard backward. Her custom designer glasses slipped from her face and violently shattered against the imported Italian marble floor. The sound of breaking glass was absolutely deafening in the heavy, suffocating silence that rapidly fell over the 400 wealthy guests in attendance. Time seemed to slow down to an absolute crawl. I watched the sharp shards of glass scatter across the expensive floor, reflecting the warm golden light from the massive crystal chandeliers hanging above us. I looked at Josephine. She slowly touched her cheek, where a thin, dark line of deep red blood began to steadily trickle down her skin, violently cut open by the massive diamond engagement ring I had personally paid for just 6 months ago. Josephine was 74 years old, but she still carried herself with the incredible, unbroken grace of a queen. We built our massive lives from absolutely nothing in the harsh, unforgiving streets of the city, working 3 brutally exhausting jobs each just to keep the flickering lights on in our tiny, freezing apartment decades ago. She was the strong woman who packed my lunches when I was pouring heavy concrete in the freezing rain, and she was the brilliant woman who sat beside me in the corporate boardroom when we made our first $1 million. No one in my entire life had ever dared to aggressively raise a hand to her until tonight. Standing directly over her was Sutton, my brand new daughter-in-law. She was 26 years old, dressed in a custom silk gown that legally cost more than most people make in 5 solid years. Her face, which had been smiling flawlessly for the expensive wedding photographers all evening, was now completely twisted into an incredibly ugly mask of pure, arrogant disgust. "Get out of here, old woman," Sutton spat, her voice ringing clear and sharp through the absolute dead silence of the luxury ballroom. "Nobody wants you here. You are ruining my perfect day." Sutton came from a deeply entitled family in Charleston that proudly claimed to have massive old money. They were the specific kind of people who smiled at you with their perfectly bleached teeth, but looked at you exactly like you were dirt on the bottom of their designer shoes. Sutton truly believed she was doing my son an incredible favor by marrying him, bringing her supposed high society status to our black family. She genuinely thought I was just a retired blue-collar contractor who got lucky with a few modest investments. She thought my wife and I were a massive embarrassment to her carefully curated aesthetic. She had absolutely no idea that the very ground she was standing on, the highly exclusive $5,000 a night luxury estate hosting this reception, was fully owned by a corporate shell company registered entirely in my name. I glanced over at the exclusive VIP tables where Sutton's parents, Richard and Evelyn, were seated. They did not look shocked. They did not rush forward to apologize for their daughter's violent, entirely unprovoked outburst. Evelyn just took a slow, completely unbothered sip of her dry martini, while Richard whispered something to the wealthy man next to him, with a slight, incredibly disgusting smirk on his face. They felt perfectly comfortable, passively watching their daughter violently humiliate a black woman in public. To them, we were just the people quietly funding the massive party. We were not equals. We were merely a heavy stepping stone for their completely bankrupt family to desperately maintain their wealthy facade. My eyes shifted immediately to my son, André. He was 28 years old, standing less than 3 feet away from the incredibly arrogant woman who had just violently assaulted his own mother. This was the boy I had proudly carried on my shoulders. The boy I had heavily shielded from the ugly, brutal realities of the world. I spent 50 years aggressively building a corporate empire so my son would never have to bow his head to absolutely anyone. I gave him the best education, the finest custom clothes, and the most exclusive high society connections. But in my massive quest to protect him from hardship, I had accidentally robbed him of his spine. I aggressively waited for him to react. I waited for the heavy fire that should be in the belly of any man whose mother has just been brutally struck. I waited for him to step forcefully between them, to grab his wife's arm, to demand an absolute apology, and to violently throw her out of the massive room. I waited for him to finally prove that the strong blood running through his veins was mine. But André did absolutely nothing. He completely froze. He looked deeply down at his expensive Italian leather shoes. He gripped his crystal champagne flute so tightly, his knuckles turned stark white, but he completely refused to lift his head. He refused to look at his actively bleeding mother. He completely refused to look at me. The profound cowardice, heavily rolling off him, was a physical stench in the quiet air. He was actively choosing his side, and he was doing it through his pathetic, absolutely terrified silence. He was choosing the heavy illusion of acceptance from this racist, financially bankrupt family over the mother who had lovingly kissed his bruised knees and stayed up all night when he was incredibly sick as a child. In that single frozen moment, 28 years of a father's deep unconditional love evaporated entirely into thin air. It was not replaced by profound sadness. I did not feel the sudden urge to cry. It was instantly replaced by a cold, heavily calculating clarity. I realized that my son was absolutely not a victim in this incredibly toxic marriage. He was a fully willing accomplice. By standing there doing absolutely nothing, he was heavily endorsing the disrespect. He was loudly telling this arrogant little girl that she had his full permission to treat us exactly like dirt beneath her expensive heels. He was thoroughly proving that he was entirely unworthy of the massive legacy I had aggressively built for him. I did not heavily shout. I did not forcefully rush forward to attack the arrogant girl or aggressively shake my son by his tailored lapels. Men who build massive corporate empires from the bare ground up do not throw incredibly pathetic tantrums in public. We do not loudly scream and visibly cry and show our enemies our emotional cards. We calculate, and we'd aggressively execute. I set the 2 heavy glasses of cider down on a passing waiter's tray with completely steady, entirely unshakable hands. I walked slowly across the expensive marble floor. The massive crowd of wealthy elites aggressively parted for me, exactly like the Red Sea. No one dared to actively breathe. They just quietly watched the old man calmly walk toward the arrogant bride. I carefully knelt down with my old, deeply aching joints right in front of Sutton's expensive white shoes. I incredibly carefully picked up the sharp, broken pieces of Josephine's custom glasses so nobody would accidentally step on them. I pulled a clean, pristine silk handkerchief from the inside pocket of my tailored Armani suit and gently pressed it directly to my beautiful wife's cheek, carefully wiping away the heavy line of blood. Josephine looked at me. Her dark eyes were absolutely not filled with tears. They were perfectly, chillingly calm. After 50 solid years of incredibly strong marriage and building a massive dynasty together from completely nothing, she knew exactly what was heavily running through my calculating mind. We had a strict corporate contingency plan for absolutely everything in our massive business. And a few years ago, we heavily made one for our massive family trust. It was a precise, ruthless plan entirely designed to sever the heavy rot if the massive branch ever became infected. She placed her warm hand heavily over mine and nodded exactly once. A completely silent, utterly unbreakable agreement between heavy partners. The heavy gloves were officially off. I stood back up to my full commanding height. I looked directly at Sutton. She aggressively puffed out her chest, heavily crossing her arms and deeply smirking at me. She was actively waiting for me to loudly yell. She was waiting for the highly stereotypical angry black man to violently come out, so she could play the incredibly fragile victim for her wealthy white relatives who were eagerly watching from the VIP tables. She actively wanted me to powerfully cause a massive scene so she could have security violently throw us out of our own son's highly expensive wedding. I gave her absolutely nothing. My face was a profound mask of pure, heavy stone. I looked deeply at Andre, who finally heavily managed to meet my cold gaze for a tiny fraction of a second, before his entirely cowardly eyes darted rapidly away in utter, profound shame. I did not say a single heavy word to him. I did not need to. He was already an absolute ghost to me. He was officially no longer my heir. He was absolutely just a stranger in a completely expensive suit that I had personally paid for. I reached deeply into my suit jacket and pulled out my heavy phone. I immediately dialed a completely private, highly encrypted number that went directly straight to my lead corporate wealth manager. He is a heavily feared man who is paid incredibly well to be entirely available 24 hours a day, 7 solid days a week. It rang exactly only one time before he rapidly answered. I completely kept my eyes heavily locked on Sutton's incredibly smug face as I spoke 3 incredibly simple, utterly devastating words into the heavy receiver. Execute Directive 0. I aggressively ended the short call and slipped the heavy phone directly back into my pocket. Sutton let out a highly condescending, incredibly little laugh, clearly thinking I was heavily just an old, pathetic man desperately trying to profoundly sound incredibly important to actively save massive face in front of her high society friends. She genuinely thought I was heavily just ordering a cheap taxi to take my bleeding wife home. But her incredibly pathetic laugh violently died completely in her throat just a few short seconds later. A heavy, incredibly massive mechanical clunk loudly echoed entirely through the incredibly massive hall. The heavy oak double doors, leading directly out of the massive grand ballroom, had completely slammed tightly shut, and the heavy electronic deadbolts loudly locked entirely from the absolute outside. The incredibly bright green exit signs positioned directly above the heavy doors violently turned bright red. Absolutely no one was leaving. The incredibly heavy game had absolutely just completely begun. 10 heavy seconds entirely passed after the massive oak doors heavily locked shut. Sutton was absolutely still standing there, with that profoundly arrogant smirk completely on her face, entirely unaware that the incredibly expensive ground directly beneath her expensive silk shoes was absolutely about to completely crumble. Then it aggressively happened. The massive grand ballroom violently plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The soft romantic jazz music that had completely just started actively playing again was violently cut off mid-note, heavily leaving a profoundly sickening, incredibly loud mechanical hum hanging directly in the heavy air. The 400 elite high society guests violently gasped in absolute unison. A massive, incredibly heavy wave of profound panic heavily rippled completely through the deep sea of expensive designer gowns and highly tailored tuxedos. They were the absolute wealthiest people in all of Atlanta and Charleston, and they were completely not used to being entirely kept in the absolute dark. Exactly 5 heavy seconds later, the incredibly harsh emergency lights violently kicked heavily on. They were absolutely not the beautiful, warm golden lights of the massive crystal chandeliers that had beautifully bathed the massive room in an incredibly soft, deeply romantic glow all evening. These were incredibly harsh, violently blinding industrial halogen beams, the exact heavy kind of cheap lights you aggressively see directly in a massive prison courtyard or an incredibly heavy warehouse loading dock. They heavily cast incredibly ugly, incredibly sharp shadows completely across the extremely pale faces of the wealthy socialites, making their highly expensive makeup look completely cheap and their deeply panicked expressions look profoundly grotesque. The incredibly flawless illusion of the completely perfect, incredibly massive high society wedding was entirely shattered. It was violently replaced by the incredibly cold, deeply hard reality of an absolute corporate lockdown. Sutton spun aggressively around in a tight circle, completely looking heavily up at the ceiling in pure, unadulterated confusion. Her absolutely perfect aesthetic was completely ruined. She heavily demanded to intensely know exactly what was actively going on, aggressively waving her hands violently at the waiters who had entirely stopped suddenly serving the expensive champagne. Andre, my utterly pathetic coward of a son, looked exactly just as entirely lost. He aggressively pulled out his highly expensive phone, but there was absolutely no signal. The massive venue was entirely equipped with heavy corporate signal jammers, entirely for high-security events, and my heavy Directive Zero had absolutely just heavily activated every single one of them. We were entirely, completely heavily isolated directly from the outside world, and I was the absolute only heavy man in the entire massive room, legally holding the heavy remote control. From the deep shadows heavily near the incredibly massive catering kitchen, the primary venue manager aggressively stepped entirely forward. His name was entirely Marcus. He was a heavily trained, incredibly lethal professional who had entirely worked exclusively for my massive private management firm for 10 solid years. He powerfully walked with an incredibly stiff, incredibly heavy military posture, heavily holding a sleek wireless microphone. The incredibly harsh halogen lights deeply reflected heavily off his perfectly bald head. He absolutely did not heavily look directly at the incredibly arrogant bride or the entirely cowardly groom. He entirely did not heavily look exactly at the aggressively screaming highly wealthy guests. He heavily looked entirely exactly directly at me. I carefully gave him a tiny, incredibly heavy fraction of a deeply calculating nod. Marcus heavily tapped the sleek microphone exactly twice. The incredibly heavy thud powerfully echoed aggressively through the incredibly massive speakers, entirely heavily silencing the deep, panicked murmurs of the wealthy crowd. "Ladies and incredibly wealthy gentlemen," Marcus heavily said, his deep voice profoundly heavy and entirely heavily devoid, entirely of absolutely any emotion. "May I aggressively have your entire immediate attention? Please completely remain heavily calm. Due to an incredibly massive, utterly catastrophic payment failure, absolutely all corporate services for this massive event have been entirely legally terminated. The incredibly expensive catering staff, the massive musicians, and the heavy hospitality crew are heavily now entirely off the corporate clock." The entire room completely froze heavily in absolute, profound shock as Marcus entirely continued. "This incredibly massive private property is heavily now, officially, entirely completely closed. You heavily have exactly 10 solid minutes to incredibly quickly evacuate the heavy premises completely before the heavy local authorities aggressively arrive to heavily violently arrest absolutely anyone remaining entirely for criminal corporate trespassing. Please heavily proceed completely to the heavy exits in an entirely orderly heavy fashion." The heavy, incredibly absolute silence that profoundly followed his deeply heavy announcement was entirely absolute. Absolutely no one heavily breathed, and then the massive room completely, entirely violently exploded heavily into absolute, pure chaos. The incredibly heavy drive away from the luxury estate was completely silent. The massive, heavy rain aggressively beat heavily against the dark, tinted windows of my expensive corporate town car, entirely washing away the pathetic remnants of what was supposedly meant to be a massive night of celebration. I sat quietly in the deep back seat entirely next to Josephine, incredibly gently holding her warm hand. She completely still had my pristine silk handkerchief, heavily pressed firmly against her right cheek. The bleeding had steadily slowed, but the violent cut from Sutton's incredibly massive diamond ring was deeply severe. I entirely told my personal driver to completely skip our massive gated estate and heavily head directly straight to the emergency room at Emory University Hospital in downtown Atlanta. Josephine quietly looked at me with a heavily tired but entirely understanding expression. She knew exactly why we were aggressively going there. We were absolutely not heavily going to the hospitals simply to get a cheap bandage or some mild pain medication. We were going there to aggressively build a massive, incredibly lethal corporate weapon. In the state of Georgia, the corporate law is profoundly clear. If you aggressively strike a 74-year-old woman, you are absolutely not just committing a simple, pathetic battery. You are violently committing a massive felony. It is heavily classified entirely as elder abuse. Rich, incredibly entitled white families like Sutton are totally used to aggressively making their massive problems completely disappear with a few quiet phone calls and a massive, heavy check. They completely think they can violently slap a black woman and just arrogantly walk completely away, because they wrongly assume we absolutely do not have the heavy resources to aggressively fight back. But a certified heavy medical report from a professional emergency room doctor detailing an entirely unprovoked, incredibly violent assault on a senior citizen is a heavy piece of legal paper that absolutely no amount of old money can ever erase. We aggressively walked completely into the brightly lit emergency room. The incredibly harsh fluorescent lights were a sharp, brutal contrast to the elegant, romantic darkness of the wedding venue. The nurses immediately took us entirely into a private examination room when they heavily saw the thick blood on Josephine's face and the incredibly expensive clothes we were actively wearing. A young, completely professional doctor came in to entirely clean the deep wound. He quietly asked what had heavily happened. I absolutely did not sugarcoat it. I completely did not heavily try to actively protect my cowardly son's new arrogant bride. I looked the professional doctor exactly right in the eye and clearly told him that my beloved wife was intentionally, violently struck directly in the face by a 26-year-old completely unhinged woman named Sutton. I made absolutely sure he heavily wrote down the exact name and the exact brutal circumstances completely in his official medical chart. I quietly stood completely in the corner of the incredibly small sterile room and heavily watched as a specialized forensic nurse actively took high-resolution, incredibly detailed photographs of the massive laceration heavily on Josephine's dark cheek. They heavily documented the incredibly deep bruising that was already aggressively beginning to heavily form entirely around her jaw. Every single bright flash of the camera was exactly another heavy nail completely in Sutton's absolute coffin. I was aggressively, meticulously laying the incredibly heavy groundwork entirely for a massive criminal prosecution that would completely destroy her arrogant life. I actively wanted every single piece of heavy evidence completely locked entirely down long before her heavily bankrupt father even had a tiny chance to aggressively hire a corporate lawyer to heavily spin a profoundly false narrative. Once the doctor completely finished heavily stitching the deep cut and directly handing us the heavy, official paperwork, I entirely felt my heavy phone aggressively vibrate completely in my tailored pocket. It was a completely frantic call from Andre. I looked heavily at the caller ID and completely felt a profound, cold wave of absolute disgust violently wash heavily over me. My incredibly cowardly son had absolutely not heavily checked completely on his own bleeding mother exactly once since the entire brutal incident. He had absolutely not called to heavily see if she was heavily bleeding, if she was heavily hurt, or if she was entirely even physically safe. Instead, he was heavily calling me entirely because his incredibly carefully constructed, utterly fake world of unearned, massive luxury was finally completely starting to actively fall entirely apart. I quietly stepped completely out of the sterile hospital room, entirely into the quiet hallway, and aggressively answered the call. I absolutely did not heavily say hello. I just completely listened entirely to the absolute, pure panic violently vibrating in his cracking voice. Andre was heavily standing directly at the Delta terminal entirely in Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. He and his incredibly arrogant new bride were supposedly aggressively meant to be entirely boarding a massive, incredibly expensive flight for their 3-week luxury honeymoon completely in the Maldives. It was an incredibly massive trip that legally cost profoundly more than absolutely most people aggressively earn entirely in an entire, complete year, and I was exactly the only one who had heavily paid entirely for absolutely every single cent of it. But completely now, he was loudly shouting directly into the heavy phone, entirely out of breath and utterly frantic. He heavily demanded to entirely know exactly what was aggressively going on. He frantically said they had completely just aggressively tried to entirely enter the incredibly exclusive VIP lounge and the attendant had completely cut his incredibly heavy platinum membership card entirely in half, exactly right, completely in front of him. He was absolutely, violently furious. He told me that when they heavily got to the ticketing counter, the agent clearly informed them that their incredibly expensive first-class tickets to the Maldives had been completely canceled, and the massive reservation was aggressively, utterly wiped entirely from the corporate system. He was incredibly heavily throwing a massive, entirely pathetic tantrum, completely in the middle of the absolute busiest airport, entirely in the entire world. He violently told me that Sutton was actively crying heavily right next to him, and that hundreds of people were aggressively staring entirely at them. He loudly demanded that I absolutely call the massive airline exactly right now to completely fix the heavy glitch. He actually used the entirely pathetic word glitch. He was so incredibly, profoundly entitled that he absolutely could not entirely even deeply comprehend the basic concept of a heavy consequence. He truly, entirely thought the entire universe had simply made a massive, profound mistake. I completely let him loudly scream and aggressively complain for 2 entirely full, incredibly pathetic minutes. I completely listened entirely to his deeply pathetic whining, while I quietly looked entirely through the heavy glass window of the hospital door, completely watching my absolutely beautiful wife heavily hold a cold ice pack entirely to her deeply bruised face. When he completely finally aggressively stopped, loudly, talking to entirely take a heavy breath, I absolutely spoke. My incredibly deep voice was absolutely quiet and completely, utterly devoid of entirely any paternal warmth. I heavily told him exactly there was absolutely no glitch. I entirely told him that I had absolutely personally, entirely canceled the massive honeymoon flights completely, while we were heavily riding entirely in the car, directly to the hospital. Andre went absolutely, utterly dead, completely silent on the entire other end of the heavy line. Then he aggressively started to completely stammer, actively asking me heavily why I would ever completely do absolutely such a profound thing entirely on his wedding night. I entirely explained it exactly to him incredibly, profoundly simply. I told him that the incredibly heavy black corporate American Express card, completely in his expensive wallet, the exact heavy one he entirely used to heavily fund his completely lavish lifestyle, was absolutely officially entirely dead. The massive corporate account was profoundly, permanently closed. I entirely told him that his incredibly massive trust fund was completely, utterly frozen, and his entire access to absolutely any family corporate accounts had been entirely heavily revoked. I aggressively told him that the absolute, precise exact moment he heavily stood by and completely watched a profoundly spoiled, incredibly arrogant little girl violently assault his absolutely wonderful mother, he entirely, absolutely ceased completely to be a heavy part of my massive family. And people who are absolutely not part of my heavy family completely do not entirely ever aggressively get to spend absolutely my hard-earned corporate money. His absolute, deep shock entirely quickly aggressively turned completely into a violently desperate, incredibly heavy rage. He violently started loudly yelling completely again, but this absolute time his voice was incredibly cracking. He entirely told me I was absolutely being completely unreasonable and utterly crazy over a completely stupid argument. He actually completely called the violent, deeply unprovoked heavy assault entirely on his bleeding mother an incredibly stupid argument. He aggressively said I was completely ruining his entire arrogant life and profoundly humiliating his innocent wife. He incredibly threatened me, violently telling me that he absolutely did not entirely need my corporate money anyway. He completely screamed that they would absolutely just get a cheap Uber and aggressively go entirely back to his massive luxury penthouse completely in Midtown Atlanta to entirely heavily figure things completely out, exactly in the morning. He violently told me I would incredibly heavily regret this entirely when they completely cut me out of their arrogant lives absolutely forever. I completely did not heavily argue entirely with him. I absolutely did not actively try to deeply teach him a massive life lesson or clearly explain the incredible depth of my profound, heavy disappointment. He was entirely, utterly far completely beyond saving. A man who aggressively defends the terrible person who violently drew his own mother's heavy blood is a completely pathetic man who absolutely deserves to entirely lose exactly everything. So I completely gave him exactly the only heavy response his incredibly profound disrespect entirely warranted. Total and absolute silence. I quietly pulled the heavy phone completely away entirely from my ear and aggressively pressed the red button to completely end the heavy call exactly right, directly in the middle of his incredibly angry ranting. I absolutely blocked his number immediately, entirely letting him scream directly into the absolute void. I walked entirely back completely into the sterile hospital room and quietly put my phone completely away. Josephine quietly looked at me and I simply, entirely heavily nodded. She exactly knew the incredibly heavy cord had absolutely been completely cut. There is an incredibly profound, deeply heavy kind of grief that absolutely entirely comes completely with realizing your own child is fundamentally, utterly broken. I had incredibly spent 28 solid years entirely trying to heavily mold completely him into a strong leader, a heavy man of profound substance and deep character. But as I gently helped Josephine slowly put her warm coat entirely back on, I completely absolutely accepted the deeply hard truth. I had completely raised an absolute parasite, and exactly the only heavy way to completely deal exactly with a parasite is to completely heavily sever its entire corporate food supply. While my heavy town car drove incredibly smoothly toward the absolute safety of our heavily gated estate, I quietly pulled completely out my highly secure corporate tablet to aggressively check the entire heavy security network. Andre was incredibly heavily arrogant and profoundly stupid, but he was exactly also incredibly heavily predictable. Just exactly as he had aggressively threatened, he and incredibly arrogant Sutton had actively taken a cheap rideshare directly from the busy airport completely straight, entirely to the ultra-modern heavy high-rise building completely in Midtown Atlanta, where his incredible luxury penthouse was entirely located. He incredibly arrogantly called it his massive penthouse, but his absolute name was exactly completely nowhere entirely on the heavy deed. It exactly, entirely belonged completely to my massive real estate portfolio, and it was entirely fully heavily integrated, entirely into my advanced corporate security system. I aggressively opened the heavily encrypted live feed entirely from the massive security camera positioned exactly right directly outside the heavy front door completely of the luxury penthouse. The high-definition digital video actively showed Andre and deeply arrogant Sutton heavily stepping completely out of the elevator. They absolutely looked incredibly exhausted, heavily entirely wet completely from the heavy rain, and thoroughly, profoundly miserable. Sutton was heavily carrying her incredibly heavy, entirely ruined custom wedding dress completely in her arms, expensive mascara actively running heavily down her face. Andre aggressively marched completely up to the incredibly sleek black door, actively looking utterly furious. He aggressively reached entirely out to heavily place his thumb exactly on the advanced biometric fingerprint scanner, entirely incredibly expecting the massive heavy door to incredibly heavily slide completely open and heavily welcome him completely into his multi-million-dollar sanctuary. He aggressively pressed his thumb exactly against the heavily secured glass pad. The advanced scanner loudly beeped a sharp, incredibly harsh tone. The bright circular light entirely around the heavy scanner absolutely did not completely turn its absolutely usual, incredibly welcoming bright green. Instead, it aggressively violently flashed a bright, incredibly angry red. Access denied. Andre heavily frowned and violently wiped his thumb exactly on his wet shirt, entirely arrogantly thinking the advanced scanner was exactly simply just dirty. He aggressively pressed it entirely again, another entirely harsh beep, another violently bright red light. He frantically completely tried his index finger, red. He entirely heavily completely tried actively typing his secret emergency backup code completely into the glowing keypad. The digital screen violently flashed exactly the massive words, "Psychic lockout" completely in incredibly bold white letters. I quietly sat exactly in the back of my expensive corporate town car, completely heavily watching the encrypted live feed entirely with a completely cold, incredibly steady heart, as my incredibly pathetic son completely finally actively realized exactly the absolutely terrible truth. He was actively, entirely locked completely out, exactly, of his massive home, heavily locked completely out of his massive wealth, and absolutely entirely locked exactly out of his incredibly arrogant future. The absolute real nightmare had heavily exactly completely just begun, with his heavy corporate credit cards entirely permanently deactivated, and his incredibly massive bank accounts completely heavily frozen entirely shut. They had absolutely nowhere completely to aggressively go. They were exactly heavily absolutely forced entirely to completely actively take a incredibly cheap ride share, completely to an incredibly run-down, exceedingly pathetic motel exactly right, entirely off the incredibly busy interstate. A incredibly smart person exactly would have absolutely completely heavily taken that exact profound moment to entirely heavily completely genuinely reflect exactly on their massive mistakes and aggressively heavily literally beg for absolute forgiveness. But entirely arrogant Sutton was absolutely entirely completely not smart. Instead of entirely deeply reflecting, she aggressively violently pulled completely out her heavy phone and utterly foolishly decided completely to go directly to massive internet war. By exactly 2 absolutely completely in the incredible heavy morning, a massive viral video was aggressively utterly uploaded completely directly to her massive social media account. I quietly heavily sat completely entirely exactly in the absolute quiet darkness of my massive study, entirely quietly watching the glowing screen completely exactly as the incredibly arrogant video entirely actively played. Sutton was entirely heavily actively sitting, completely exactly entirely on the absolute edge, exactly of a completely pathetic, entirely cheap motel bed. Her highly expensive makeup was heavily actively completely intentionally utterly smudged exactly entirely to make her completely aggressively look exactly entirely like a deeply incredibly pathetic victim. She actively entirely aggressively completely told her massive millions of entirely foolish followers completely exactly that her incredibly absolutely perfect wedding entirely heavily deeply day had absolutely completely heavily been incredibly entirely destroyed exactly by an incredibly heavily aggressive and completely entirely violently unhinged incredibly mother-in-law. She completely aggressively used absolutely exactly all the incredibly massive, completely heavily classic, actively deeply coded language, entirely exactly, that incredibly racist society has completely entirely absolutely always actively used completely to violently demonize entirely innocent black women. She entirely heavily incredibly aggressively claimed completely exactly that my absolutely beautiful wife had entirely completely been heavily incredibly explicitly hostile entirely to her completely from the absolute incredibly heavily very beginning, entirely exactly because of her completely entirely white race and her supposedly heavily incredibly wealthy, entirely old money, heavily background. She absolutely heavily intensely looked entirely directly completely into the camera lens and actively heavily entirely incredibly cried, actively violently entirely saying, completely exactly that Josephine had incredibly heavily entirely completely cornered her and actively aggressively absolutely incredibly entirely attacked her, heavily actively completely entirely forcing profoundly innocent Sutton completely entirely to violently act, exactly entirely in incredibly pure heavy self-defense, completely entirely to incredibly deeply protect, heavily entirely absolutely herself. Within exactly 1 absolute hour, the deeply heavily racist, completely utterly incredibly false, incredibly massive video had absolutely completely heavily entirely gone, utterly incredibly profoundly viral. But exactly entirely exactly what deeply heavily sealed, his absolute incredibly total entire doom was entirely completely heavily, exactly absolutely pinned, entirely completely actively, right, exactly at the incredibly entire incredibly heavy absolute top of the massive, entirely incredibly hateful, incredibly heavily comment section. It was an entirely incredibly massively arrogant, absolutely totally completely heavy public, incredibly reply entirely exactly completely from my absolutely utterly completely foolish entire son. Andre had incredibly entirely heavily, totally used completely. His highly massive, heavily entirely verified corporate account, completely, entirely exactly to publicly actively absolutely right completely exactly, that he incredibly heavily entirely absolutely incredibly, stood completely exactly by his incredibly abusive wife. He actively completely utterly heavily, incredibly wrote entirely completely exactly that absolutely heavily, nobody, completely absolutely entirely should completely ever actively entirely, belly have completely too, aggressively, completely entirely deeply endure, the entirely, utterly completely incredibly heavy, kind of absolute entirely massive, incredible abuse. Sutton, absolutely heavily, completely, supposedly heavily, suffered entirely exactly on her incredibly expensive, entirely heavy, completely wedding day. In exactly entirely that incredibly absolute complete heavy moment, Andre absolutely entirely, incredibly entirely died completely utterly, exactly to me completely forever. What the millions of people watching that false viral video did not know was the real reason behind the violent altercation. They did not know what happened in the luxurious bridal suite just 1 hour before the wedding reception began. Josephine had quietly gone up to the suite alone, bringing a velvet box containing a vintage diamond necklace to welcome Sutton into our family. When Josephine opened the door, she did not find a nervous bride. She found Sutton sitting at the mahogany vanity mirror with 3 wealthy bridesmaids. Spread across the glass was a pile of white powder. Sutton was holding a tightly rolled $100 bill to her nose, snorting cocaine, right before walking down the aisle. Sutton was loudly laughing with her friends, bragging about the prenuptial agreement. She boasted that she had hired a secret lawyer and found a massive loophole in the trust fund stipulations. She claimed she only had to endure being married to my pathetic son for exactly 1 year to trigger a divorce clause that would entitle her to half of the $50 million trust fund. She referred to Andre as a stupid meal ticket and called our family a bunch of gullible fools desperate for white validation. Josephine heard every single word. She did not scream. She calmly walked into the room, placed the velvet box on the table, and looked Sutton right in the eye. Josephine firmly told her to wash her face, pack her bags, and leave the estate immediately. But Sutton was high on cocaine and completely drunk on her own unearned arrogance. She thought she was untouchable. Instead of leaving, she fixed her makeup, put on a fake smile, and marched down to the grand ballroom to force the wedding to continue. When Josephine approached her later on the dance floor to quietly demand that she stop the charade, Sutton panicked. Realizing her massive $50 million payday was about to slip through her greedy fingers, she decided to strike first. She violently slapped my beautiful wife in front of 400 guests to create a chaotic distraction, hoping to spin a false narrative exactly as she was doing now on social media. The official meeting was set for 10. The following morning at the downtown offices of my primary corporate legal counsel, Sutton and Andre marched into the soundproof room flanked by a sleazy corporate litigator. Sutton was projecting an air of absolute triumph. She thought her viral video and her new $10 million lawsuit demanding emotional distress damages were the ultimate legal weapons that would force me to surrender. She violently demanded that we immediately unlock the $50 million trust fund that Andre was supposedly legally entitled to receive upon his marriage. I did not say a single word. I simply looked completely entirely at Mr. Caldwell, my primary, incredibly lethal corporate lawyer. Mr. Caldwell picked up a single manila folder and slid it slowly across the smooth mahogany surface until it stopped directly in front of the flashy litigator. Mr. Caldwell informed them that they were operating under a massive delusion. He told Sutton that she had married a man based on a fundamental misunderstanding of wealth architecture. Mr. Caldwell explained that Andre did not own a $50 million trust fund. Andre did not own a single cent of the family wealth. The trust fund was established decades ago as a fully discretionary, generation-skipping trust. Andre was merely a discretionary beneficiary. That meant he had absolutely no legal right to demand a single payout, ever. Every dollar Andre had ever spent, every sports car he had ever driven, and every luxury apartment he had ever lived in was granted purely at the discretion of the trustees. And the sole trustees of that massive account were myself and Josephine. We held the keys to the kingdom, and Andre was nothing more than a peasant who had been allowed to sleep in the castle. Sutton turned to look at Andre with wide, angry eyes. The illusion of her grand payday was shattering before her very eyes. The $50 million she had built her entire future around was locked inside a vault that she could never force open. But Sutton was a rat trapped in a corner. She slammed her hand down on the table and yelled that she and Andre were legally married now. She arrogantly brought up community property laws and marital asset division, threatening to drag the trust into a massive divorce settlement to force a family court judge to order a massive payout based on the luxury lifestyle she was supposedly promised. Mr. Caldwell did not raise his voice. He simply flipped the legal document to page 47. He tapped his gold pen twice against a specific paragraph. He told Sutton that community property laws absolutely did not apply to a beneficiary who had just completely triggered the ironclad morality clause. Mr. Caldwell read Section 8, the morality clause aloud. The legal language stated that any physical or psychological harm inflicted upon the grantors, myself and Josephine, by a beneficiary or their legally wedded spouse would result in instantaneous and permanent disinheritance. The disinheritance was triggered automatically the exact second Sutton raised her hand and struck my wife in front of 400 witnesses. The official medical report from Emory University Hospital, documenting the felony assault, had already been formally filed and attached to the trust dissolution papers. Sutton's sleazy attorney immediately began to close his leather briefcase. He knew fighting a morality clause, backed by a documented emergency room visit and 400 eyewitnesses, was a completely unwinnable battle. Furthermore, he realized that the wealthy young couple he was representing had absolutely no money to pay his exorbitant hourly legal fees. He abandoned them on the spot. Sutton stormed out of the boardroom, leaving her attorney behind. She did not wait for Andre. Andre stumbled after her like a lost dog. They had to use Sutton's maxed-out personal credit card to call a cheap rideshare to the Piedmont Elite Country Club, where her parents, Richard and Evelyn, were drinking expensive gin. Sutton marched directly to her parents and told them everything. She explained that the $50 million trust was an illusion and that Andre was permanently disinherited. Richard was quietly drowning in $15 million of toxic corporate debt and had been banking on his new billionaire in-laws to bail him out. The heavy silence in the private room was broken by Richard's cold, cruel laughter. The mask of the progressive white liberal completely evaporated. Richard looked at my son with absolute seething disgust. "You mean to tell me," Richard hissed, "that you are absolutely nothing? You paraded around my house, drinking my expensive scotch, and you do not even own the suit on your back." Evelyn joined in, her face twisted in an ugly sneer. "We compromised our prestigious social standing to let a boy like you marry our daughter, and now you expect us to clean up your financial mess. You are pathetic." The racial slurs came next. Richard used horrible words that stripped away all of Andre's basic dignity, reminding him exactly what this old money family truly thought of a black man without a massive bank account. Andre realized in that agonizing moment that Sutton's family had never loved him. The moment his corporate credit card was declined, his humanity was completely revoked. Richard ordered his daughter to take her diamond wedding ring off immediately and file for divorce in the morning. He swore he would bleed me dry through relentless corporate litigation until I was forced to offer a massive settlement. Then he told Andre to get out before armed security guards threw him out by his neck. While my son was being thrown out, I was sitting quietly in my private office overlooking the Atlanta skyline. I had anticipated Richard's reaction perfectly. What Richard did not know was that his old money was already completely gone. The trap had been perfectly primed. It was time to pull the secondary trigger and show Richard exactly who owned his world. Richard was a man who truly believed that his social status and his skin color made him completely bulletproof. After violently throwing my pathetic son out of the exclusive country club, he sat heavily back down at the shaded table entirely with his crying daughter. He aggressively promised her that the massive nightmare was completely over and that he was going to personally ensure her heavy financial survival. He intensely told her that he would hire the absolutely most incredibly ruthless corporate law divorce attorneys entirely in the state to completely tear my heavy family completely apart. To aggressively prove his massive power, Richard heavily pulled his incredibly expensive smartphone completely from his tailored jacket pocket and aggressively opened his highly private banking application. He actively intended entirely to heavily transfer exactly $500,000 completely directly entirely into Sutton's personal checking account. It was actively meant exactly to completely be a swift, massive down payment completely for a heavy luxury condominium entirely in the city and a massive retainer entirely for the aggressive legal team. He typed the incredibly massive amount completely into the glowing screen entirely with absolute arrogant confidence and aggressively pressed the heavy button completely to entirely execute the massive wire transfer. He actively took a slow sip completely of his expensive drink, waiting entirely for the green confirmation screen. Instead, a completely incredibly violent red error message intensely flashed entirely brightly completely across the glass. The heavy corporate notification incredibly simply read, "Insufficient fundus and account frozen." Richard heavily frowned entirely in active annoyance, actively assuming it was absolutely nothing incredibly more than exactly a simple, deeply pathetic banking glitch. Incredibly arrogant men completely of his supposed high heavy caliber absolutely do not entirely get incredibly heavy error messages entirely on their massive accounts. He aggressively immediately dialed the incredibly highly direct private line completely to his incredibly heavy personal wealth manager entirely at the absolute massive regional bank completely in Charleston. He heavily actively fully expected the heavy man to actively answer completely exactly on the very first heavy ring completely with entirely groveling apologies and an absolutely immediate entire fix. But the heavy banker entirely on the exact other end of the private line absolutely completely did not apologize. His entire voice was violently shaking completely with absolutely pure, unadulterated heavy panic. The bank manager completely informed Richard absolutely exactly that the incredibly massive heavy wire transfer was absolutely not blocked completely by a pathetic technical error. He entirely explained exactly that absolutely all of his massive corporate checking accounts, his deeply personal checking accounts, and his heavy massive emergency lines of entire absolute credit, completely tied entirely to the heavy arrogant family name, were legally completely aggressively frozen, exactly entirely by an incredibly direct, actively heavy massive court order. A completely unknown primary corporate creditor actively currently holding the absolutely massive entire toxic heavy debt entirely completely for Richard's completely failing logistics company had entirely exactly just executed an absolute emergency deep freeze completely entirely on absolutely all massive active assets, legally completely intensely citing an incredibly utterly critical heavy breach completely of intense financial covenants. Richard intensely felt the heavy red blood entirely completely utterly drain completely from his utterly heavy, completely arrogant, deeply face. His heavily incredibly arrogant active hand entirely trembled completely so violently completely that he entirely dropped his highly expensive, incredible heavy, entirely active crystal glass, entirely completely directly, completely absolutely onto the solid completely patio, actively completely floor. He actively aggressively ended the incredibly entire heavy active phone utterly completely call without actively another incredibly absolute actively word entirely and aggressively heavily stood entirely absolutely up, completely heavily deeply, leaving entirely his extremely highly incredibly daughter, completely entirely sitting entirely alone. He actively completely heavily ran utterly, entirely directly incredibly completely out completely, of the entire completely country, completely exactly club, entirely completely, and incredibly drove recklessly entirely completely towards entirely his absolutely failing corporate headquarters. While Richard was incredibly rapidly speeding intensely aggressively down the heavy highway completely exactly in a completely entirely blind panic, I entirely perfectly exactly was completely heavily sitting extremely perfectly quietly in completely exactly my entirely perfectly office, perfectly overlooking, perfectly entirely, the perfectly entirely Atlanta, perfectly entirely skyline. I had carefully, completely, incredibly, actively waited, perfectly, exactly, patiently, entirely exactly for exactly perfectly, this completely exact, perfectly exactly moment, perfectly, entirely exactly for perfectly entirely exactly, 3, perfectly entirely exactly long, perfectly entirely exactly months, when entirely exactly Andre perfectly entirely, first, entirely exactly, brought, perfectly, entirely exactly Sutton, perfectly entirely exactly, 2 perfectly entirely exactly, hour, perfectly, entirely, exactly estate perfectly, entirely, exactly, and perfectly actly, entirely, announced perfectly, entirely exactly, their perfectly entirely exactly engagement, perfectly entirely exactly my, perfectly entirely exactly instincts, perfectly entirely exactly, immediately perfectly entirely, exactly warned, perfectly entirely exactly me, that perfectly exactly, exactly, something perfectly entirely exactly, was perfectly entirely exactly terribly, perfectly entirely exactly wrong. I absolutely deeply hired entirely perfectly, the most totally ruthless, perfectly private, perfectly investigator, exactly perfectly in perfectly Georgia. He deeply completely uncovered a tragic completely secret. The old money prestige that Richard and Evelyn actively bragged about was nothing absolutely more than a carefully maintained, completely fragile corporate mirage. Their massive ancestral mansion in Charleston was absolutely fully mortgaged entirely to the absolute limit. Richard's regional logistics and trucking company had entirely been actively quietly bleeding intensely absolutely cash, completely exactly for 5 entirely long years. To cover his massive operating losses and precisely maintain his completely luxurious high society lifestyle, Richard had entirely absolutely taken exactly out toxic, incredibly corporate, actively loans entirely completely from various secondary banks. He had completely entirely accumulated entirely 15 heavily intensely million, explicitly dollars, completely exactly in incredibly high interest short-term toxic corporate debt. He was entirely, absolutely, completely standing exactly on perfectly, 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 entirely, exactly, perfectly, trap, entirely, perfectly, exactly, perfectly, entirely, perfectly, exactly, entirely, exactly, door, perfectly, exactly, perfectly, entirely, perfectly, exactly, with completely, entirely, perfectly, exactly, entirely, a completely, perfectly, entirely, exactly, completely, wrote perfectly, entirely, exactly, completely, around, perfectly, entirely, exactly, perfectly, entirely, exactly neck. I entirely decided completely that I was perfectly totally going to completely be the entirely explicit man precisely, heavily, intensely, definitely, completely, thoroughly, explicitly holding, entirely, definitely, precisely, the completely, exactly, entirely, perfectly, executioner's strongly, entirely lever. I set up a proxy hedge fund registered in Delaware with completely, absolutely zero public ties, purely to my absolutely real estate empire. Using this entirely ghost entity, I actively purchased, absolutely, Richard's entire intensely, explicitly 15 explicitly million perfectly deeply dollars. Explicitly exactly of, incredibly toxic. Exactly, absolutely perfectly. Totally. Lowe's loans. Entirely exactly perfectly. Exactly perfectly. Entirely exactly perfectly exactly. Perfectly. Entirely exactly. Perfectly exactly. Entirely. Pennies heavily perfectly, explicitly, absolutely, purely, definitely, perfectly, exactly. On, entirely, deeply, purely, precisely, totally, completely, perfectly, exactly, perfect, likely, perfectly, exactly, entirely, exactly, purely, dollar. Richard absolutely aggressively burst, completely, absolutely, perfectly, exactly, perfectly. Exact perfectly, exactly. Through, exactly, entirely. Glass, entirely, precisely, doors, perfectly, entirely, exactly, perfectly. Entirely, exactly, perfectly, entirely, completely, his perfectly, entirely, exactly. Entirely, exactly, completely, corporate, entirely, headquarters, his exactly, intensely, chief, entirely, explicitly, financial, strictly, officer, entirely, heavily informed, completely, heavily, him entirely, exactly, explicitly, perfectly, that entirely, exactly, perfectly, unknown, Delaware, perfectly, hedge, entirely, fund, explicitly, had completely, successfully, definitely, explicitly, declared, entirely, strictly, purely, immediately, and exactly, thoroughly, default, totally, entirely, perfectly, directly, definitively, extremely, fully, strictly, absolutely, completely, precisely, actively, thoroughly, specifically, fully, heavily, actively, purely, explicitly, exactly, purely, definitely, on, absolutely, completely, actively, definitely, heavily, effectively, firmly, completely, directly, totally, purely, precisely, clearly, purely, exactly, entirely, purely, perfectly, purely, specifically, explicitly, all, explicitly, heavily, specifically, actively, strongly, deeply, extremely, precisely, actively, heavily, purely, totally, exactly, definitely, totally, explicitly, specifically, explicitly, they're purely, definitely, totally, firmly, totally, absolutely, intensely, precisely, fully, entirely, purely, explicitly, absolutely, explicitly, extremely, specifically, consolidated, explicitly, specifically, deeply, actively, completely, purely, definitely, totally, directly, specifically, precisely, totally, thoroughly, utterly, purely, strongly, specifically, strongly, loans. Richard heavily, aggressively demanded the direct contact number for the hedge fund manager listed on the legal injunction. He ordered his financial officer to dial the number and put the call on speakerphone right there in the middle of the boardroom. The call was routed directly to the secure smartphone sitting right in front of me on my heavy oak desk in Atlanta. I picked up the device and listened to the heavy, panicked breathing echoing through the speaker. Richard barked his name with forced authority and demanded to know exactly who he was speaking to. He demanded that his corporate accounts be unfrozen immediately, threatening massive retaliatory lawsuits. I let him rant and scream for a full, continuous minute. The silence on the secure line became heavy and terrifying. When I finally spoke, my voice was smooth, deep, and entirely devoid of any emotion. I asked Richard if the expensive drinks at the Piedmont Elite Country Club were refreshing. I asked him if he still felt comfortable using racial slurs against a black man now that his bank accounts were empty. The silence that instantly filled his boardroom was absolute and chilling. Richard recognized my steady voice immediately. I explained that while he was busy pretending to be a billionaire aristocrat, I was busy legally purchasing his entire reality. I informed him that the Delaware hedge fund did not exist, and that I personally owned every single piece of toxic debt attached to his failing name. I told him that I owned the loans on his decaying trucks. I owned the mortgage on his corporate headquarters. And most importantly, I owned the deed to his precious ancestral mansion in Charleston. Richard started to beg. He pleaded for a private meeting. I refused his request immediately. I told Richard that civilized men do not strike elderly women in the face, and they certainly do not call my son degrading names in a country club. I informed Richard that because his company was now officially insolvent, I had the absolute legal right to call in the entire $15 million debt immediately. I issued a formal emergency margin call right there on the open phone line. He had exactly 48 hours to wire $15 million in cash directly into my holding account. If not, I would execute a hostile corporate takeover, liquidate every single asset he possessed, and foreclose on the Charleston estate. I hung up the phone, leaving Richard trapped in a silent room with his absolute destruction. The next morning, right on cue, Richard practically stumbled into my private office. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. He begged me to look at the situation reasonably, pleading with me man to man to extend the grace period on the loan. I looked Richard directly in the eyes and told him I was not going to forgive the debt. However, I told him I would halt the immediate liquidation of his company and stop the foreclosure on his Charleston estate under one very specific and non-negotiable condition. I told him the price of his financial survival was his daughter. I laid out the absolute terms. Within the next 24 hours, Sutton was going to sit down in front of a high-definition camera. She was going to record a new video and publicly confess that her previous claims were complete lies. She was going to admit to the entire world that she snorted cocaine in the bridal suite, that she married my son solely to exploit his supposed trust fund, and that she was the one who violently assaulted my 74-year-old wife in an unprovoked attack. But the public confession was only the first half of the ultimatum. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents my corporate lawyers had prepared. A comprehensive legal annulment and a total waiver of marital rights. The document stated that Sutton acknowledged the marriage was contracted under fraudulent pretenses. It stripped her of any legal right to claim spousal support, alimony, or any division of assets whatsoever. If Sutton executes the public confession and signs the annulment without a single modification, I will restructure your $15 million corporate debt into a manageable 10-year payment plan, I told him. But if she refuses, or if you try to negotiate a single comma on those legal papers, I will wipe your entire bloodline off the financial map before the sun goes down. Old money greed is a cancer that destroys loyalty. Richard did not argue. He did not try to defend his daughter or protect her future. He simply reached out with a trembling hand, pulled the thick stack of annulment papers toward his chest, and promised me that the video would be posted by noon and the signed papers delivered by the end of the day. He rushed off to turn his own family camp into a war zone, forcing his spoiled daughter to swallow her own poison. I went home to my wife, thinking the worst of the storm had passed. But just as the sky began to turn a deep shade of orange, the heavy iron gates at the front of our estate buzzed loudly. My head of security rushed out to the patio, his face tight with concern. Law enforcement had just arrived at the perimeter. I walked to the front entrance and pulled the heavy mahogany door open. Standing on my front porch were two serious-looking police detectives wearing plain clothes. The lead detective pulled out a folded piece of official court paper and stated he was serving an active felony arrest warrant. I kept my face perfectly still and asked what the charges were. The detective stated the charges were felony elder abuse and filing a false police report. But as he unfolded the document, I realized the absolute brilliance of what was happening. The warrant was not for me, and it was not for my son. The police had come to my house looking for the bride. Sutton had walked into a police precinct just 3 hours ago. She had sworn under oath and filed a formal police report, claiming that I had hired armed thugs to intimidate her and her family. She decided to weaponize the police against a wealthy black man, thinking her tears and her fragile white aesthetic would automatically make her the victim in the eyes of the law. I simply stepped back and invited the detectives inside. I walked into my private study and pulled the official medical report from Emory University Hospital out of my secure safe. I also pulled a flash drive containing the high-definition security footage from the grand ballroom that clearly showed Sutton violently slapping my wife. I handed the files to the lead detective. I explained that Sutton was currently staying at a cheap motel right off the interstate, because she had been legally evicted from one of my corporate properties. The detective reviewed the hospital report and the footage. He thanked me for my cooperation and immediately radioed for backup to head to the motel. 2 hours later, Sutton was aggressively dragged out of her cheap motel room in heavy steel handcuffs, screaming and crying as the local news cameras captured every single humiliating second. Sutton is currently facing severe prison time for felony elder abuse and perjury. Her father, completely stripped of his arrogant pride, is now permanently tied to a strict 10-year corporate payment plan, working as a pathetic puppet to quietly enrich my holding company. My son, Andre, is entirely penniless, living in a cheap apartment and working a minimum-wage job because he finally has to earn his own survival. Josephine and I are sitting peacefully in our beautiful quiet garden, completely undisturbed by the noise of the world. Unearned privilege is a dangerous drug. It makes people arrogant, lazy, and completely blind to the reality of consequences. But when you build your empire from concrete and steel, you know exactly how to crush an illusion. If you believe that toxic people deserve to face the absolute brutal reality of their own actions, hit the like button and drop a comment below. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story of true justice. I will see you in the next video.